The morning Jesus came to my gate, I sent him away. I need to say that first. Not as a confession for sympathy, as the fact everything else in my life grows out of. He came dressed the way poor men dress in July in Savannah. Sweat-dark shirt, worn shoes, a bag over one shoulder that had seen better decades. He stood at my gate at 8 in the morning and he asked for a glass of water. I told him to move along. My name is Solomon Stein. I'm 64 years old. I was raised Jewish in a family that took the faith seriously. Shabbat dinners, high holy days, Hebrew school, the whole structure of it. I became a real estate developer in my 30s, and by my 50s I had built something that my grandfather, who came to Georgia with nothing, would have called impossible. 300 units of commercial property, a house in the historic district, a Mercedes and a second one for my wife Miriam. A life that looked from the outside like proof that you could make it in America if you were willing to work. I was not, by the standards of my upbringing, a bad man. I gave to the Jewish Federation. I showed up at the synagogue for the holidays. I employed 50 people, paid them fairly, never stole from anyone. I had rules about how I conducted business and I followed them. I want to tell you something about what it means to grow up Jewish and then build a life like mine. My father came to Savannah from Poland in 1937. He came with the name that got shortened to Stein at Ellis Island, a suitcase, and $30. He built a small dry goods business that he worked 6 days a week for 30 years. He was not a demonstrably religious man, but he was a man who followed the rules as he understood them, and one of the rules he followed without exception was this: you don't turn away a person who is hungry or thirsty. You just don't. He kept a jar of quarters by the door, not hidden, sitting right there on the entry table. Whenever someone came to the door asking for help, he took a quarter from the jar and gave it. No questions, no sermon. Quarter, thank you. Door closes. I asked him once why he didn't at least ask what they needed the money for. He said, "Solly, that's their business. My business is the quarter." My mother's version of this was more theological. She kept a Bible and a prayer book open on the kitchen table, and she'd reference them like other people reference cookbooks. The Torah, she said, is not subtle about this. Leave the edges of the field for the stranger. Welcome the stranger because you were strangers in Egypt. At Passover, we open the door and say, "Let all who are hungry come and eat." I had been saying those words every April for 60 years, at a table in my house with a Seder plate that cost more than my father made in a month. I said them, and I meant them in the abstract, in the ceremonial way you can mean something while never actually doing it. The tradition I was raised in is not indifferent to the poor. I just was. What I didn't have was what my mother used to call a soft place in the chest. She'd say, "Solly, a man without a soft place in his chest is just a machine with a pulse." I thought she was being poetic. I didn't understand that she was describing me. Before you keep reading, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to see how far this reaches. He showed up on a Tuesday in July. Hot the way Savannah gets in the summer, the kind of heat that feels personal, like the air is trying to get inside you. My wife, Miriam, was at her book club. I should tell you about Miriam because she is the other half of this story, even though she didn't know she was in it yet. We have been married 38 years. She is a good woman, better than I have usually deserved, patient with my work obsessions, gracious with people I was often not gracious with, genuinely warm in social situations where I was performing warmth. She had her own faith, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It showed up in practical ways: meals brought to sick neighbors, showing up at funerals without being asked, remembering the names of people's grandchildren that I'd already forgotten. She did these things because she thought they were right, not because anyone was keeping score. I had been benefiting from this for 38 years without ever really noticing it as a quality she had. I just thought she was better at social things than me. I had taken all of this for granted in the way you take for granted the weather, noticing when it's bad, barely noticing when it's good. What I didn't know on that Tuesday morning while she was at her book club was that my wife's quality of heart was about to be tested alongside mine. Just differently. My wife was at her book club. My housekeeper was in the kitchen. I was on the terrace with my coffee and my phone, reviewing an offer on a property near River Street. The gate buzzer went off. I looked up at the security monitor. A man. Older, Maybe 65, maybe 70. Hard to tell. Face weathered in the way of someone who spends a lot of time outside. A canvas bag on his shoulder. He was standing still. Not fidgeting. Not looking around nervously the way people sometimes do at my gate when they've come to ask for something they think I'll refuse. He was just there. Patient. Waiting. I pressed the intercom. "What do you need?" He looked up at the camera. His eyes. I still see them. Even on a grainy security monitor. Something about the way they landed. Not sad, not pleading. Just present, like he had all the time in the world. "Sir," he said, "I've been walking a long time. Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" I almost said yes. I want to be honest about that because the testimony doesn't work if I make myself worse than I was. I wasn't a cruel man standing at a gate looking for reasons to deny water to a stranger. I was a distracted man who had trained himself over decades to make small decisions efficiently and move on. 4 seconds. Water, yes or no. Unknown person. Private gate. No clear reason to be there. The easiest answer was no. I almost said yes, I want to be honest about that. For about 2 seconds, I almost reached down and buzzed the gate open. But then I thought about the offer on the River Street property, and about the fact that if I let one person in like this, it would get around, and about something I'd told myself so many times it had become like weather. That my responsibility to people who came to my gate uninvited was essentially zero, because I had earned what I had, and nobody was entitled to a piece of it. "Sir," I said, "I can't help you today." He didn't argue. He didn't look angry. He looked at the camera one more moment and said quietly, "Mr. Stein, someday you'll be thirsty and you'll remember this moment." He left. I watched the monitor until he turned the corner. Then I went back to my phone. The River Street deal closed 3 weeks later. I didn't think about him for days. That's the part I have the hardest time with. Days. Across town, in a neighborhood I never drove through by choice, a woman named Ruth Carpenter was kneeling at the foot of her son's bed at 7 in the morning, praying the same prayer she'd prayed every morning for 4 months. "God, you know I can't pay for this surgery. You know Daniel can't take another winter like the last one. You know we've tried everything. Please. Just please." Her son was 7 years old. Daniel. Born with a heart defect that the doctors at the clinic had explained with terms Ruth had to write down and look up later. They'd told her the surgery was the only option. They'd also told her the surgery cost more than she made in 3 years combined. Her husband James worked construction. He was a good man in the specific way that doesn't get noticed much. Never late, never drunk, never the kind of man who complains about his back or the heat or the foreman. He just showed up and did the work. He had been doing the work for 22 years, and between his wages and Ruth's job at the school cafeteria, they had managed to make a life in a house that was theirs and pay the bills most months. Until Daniel. The cost of the surgery had reorganized their entire existence. Not dramatically. It wasn't like they stopped eating. It was the subtler way that a large, impossible number changes how you look at everything. Ruth started buying the store brand of everything. She stopped getting her hair cut. James told her he'd taken an extra Saturday job and she didn't ask what it was because she could see in his face that the truth would break her. 4 months of this. Her husband James worked construction. Good man, strong hands, never late, never drunk, never complained about anything. He left every morning before 6. He came home every evening around 7. And every night after Ruth thought he was asleep, she could hear him in the bathroom, running the water so she wouldn't hear him cry. I tell you about Ruth and James not because their goodness earned them what happened next. I used to think goodness worked like that, like a ledger, like a transaction. You put in enough righteous acts and the universe pays out. I know now that's not how it works. But I also know that the way they lived meant that when the man came to their door, they were ready to receive him, even though they had almost nothing to give. He came around 9 that same morning. Knocked on the door. Not a buzzer, just his knuckles on the wood, the old way. James had already left. Ruth answered. The man at the door was older, weathered in the way of someone who has been outside for years. Canvas bag on one shoulder. He had the kind of face that makes you think he'd seen a lot of roads. He asked if she might have a little water and something to eat. He said he'd been walking a long time and it was already hot. Ruth said, "Come in." Just like that. No hesitation, no looking him up and down, no weighing of risks. "Come in." This is the thing about Ruth that I still turn over. She had no more than James's construction wages and her cafeteria job. She had a sick child and a stack of medical bills and a refrigerator that wasn't full. She had real reasons to say no, to say sorry, to say I can't help you today. The same words I had said at my gate that morning from behind an iron fence and a security monitor and 60 years of accumulated property. She had almost nothing and she opened the door all the way. I've asked her about this. I asked her why she didn't hesitate. She looked at me like I'd asked why she breathed. She said, "He asked." "That's all?" He asked. That's the entire theology of what Ruth did. He asked, she answered. He came around 9 that same morning, knocked on the door, not a buzzer, just his knuckles on the wood. James had already left. Ruth answered. The man at the door was older, weathered, canvas bag on one shoulder. He looked the way hard years look on a person. He asked if she might have a little water and maybe something to eat, that he'd been walking a long time, and it was already hot. Ruth said, "Come in." She said it without hesitating, the way some people can do that, the way that's always seemed miraculous to me because I've never been able to do it, just, "Come in." She gave him water in a glass that didn't match anything else in the cabinet. She didn't have much food. She was being careful with the money because of Daniel's treatment costs. But she had bread and a little cheese, and she put it in front of him like it was a real meal. He ate slowly. The way you eat when you're actually hungry, not performing hunger. Ruth sat across from him. They talked. He asked about her family. She told him about Daniel. She didn't plan to, it just came out. The way things come out when you've been carrying them alone for a long time and someone asks with real attention. "I'm sorry," the man said. She said she was managing. She said she believed God hadn't forgotten them. He looked at her for a moment. Then he asked if he could see the boy. Now. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Leave a comment right now with a single word. Door. Just door. Because this story is about doors. The ones we open and the ones we don't. And I want to know how many of you are with me in it. Daniel was still asleep. Ruth opened the door to his room. The man stood in the doorway and looked at the boy sleeping. Then he walked over, sat on the edge of the bed, and put his hand on Daniel's chest. Daniel opened his eyes. He wasn't startled. Ruth told me this 3 times when she told me the story. She kept coming back to it. A 7-year-old waking up to a stranger sitting on his bed should be frightened. That's what 7-year-olds do. They wake up afraid of the dark and strangers and unfamiliar voices. But Daniel opened his eyes and looked at the man, and his face was completely calm. The way it is when you see someone you've been waiting to see. Daniel opened his eyes. He wasn't startled. That was the first thing Ruth noticed. A 7-year-old boy waking up to a stranger at his bedside and not being afraid. He just looked at the man and said, "I know you." The man smiled. "How do you know me?" Daniel thought about it. The way kids think with their whole face. Then he said, "You're in my dreams." The man's hand was still on Daniel's chest. He said quietly, "You're going to be okay. When your mama takes you to the doctor on Thursday, you're going to be okay." He said it the way you say a thing you already know, not like a prediction, like a report. Ruth told me that as he said it, Daniel looked down at the man's hand on his chest. Then he took a breath, a deep breath, the kind you take when you've been breathing shallowly for so long you've forgotten what a real breath feels like. He looked up at his mother. "Mama," he said. "I feel different," Ruth said. "Different how?" He thought about it. Then he put his own hand on top of the man's hand, the small one over the large one, and said, like something heavy got moved. Ruth was crying by the time she got it together enough to speak. She offered him more food. He said he was all right. He stood up, went back to the door of the room, stopped and looked at Ruth. "You gave what you had," he said. "It's enough. It's always been enough." He walked to the front door, put his shoes back on. He'd taken them off when he came in, out of respect, she told me later, and he left. Ruth sat on the kitchen floor for a long time. She didn't know why she sat on the floor. She just needed to be low down for a while. "I'm going to tell you now what happened on Thursday, but first I want to finish telling you about me, because I'm the testimony here, and the testimony isn't pretty yet. I didn't find out about Ruth and Daniel for 2 weeks. I found out the way you find out about things you should have been part of but weren't. Secondhand, too late, from someone else's voice. I want to describe this moment carefully because I think the mechanics of how I learned it matter as much as what I learned. Keith had been my property manager for 15 years. He is a man of even temperament who reports facts without drama. He came into my office on a Wednesday afternoon to discuss a maintenance issue at one of the Drayton Street units, and at the end of the meeting, as he was gathering his paperwork, he said something in the tone people use for things they've been meaning to mention. "You know what, Mr. Stein, my neighbor's kid apparently got better. The one with the heart thing. They were supposed to have surgery." I said, "That's good news." He said, "Yeah, they took him in, and the doctor ran the tests and there was nothing wrong. The doctor ran them 3 times. I said, "Just nothing wrong?" He said, "Nothing wrong." Like it hadn't been there. I said I was glad to hear it. He said, "Yeah. His mother said some man came to their house. She thought he was, one of those." I said, "One of those what?" He looked slightly uncomfortable, the way people look when they're about to say something they don't know how to categorize. He said, "An angel." She thought he might have been an angel. The office got very quiet. Keith noticed that I had gone still. He said, "You okay?" I said, "What did this man look like?" He thought about it. He said, "Older, weathered face, had a bag of some kind, canvas bag." I said, "Did she say what he was wearing?" Keith looked at me carefully now, trying to work out why I was asking. He said, "I think she said a white shirt, or it used to be white. Something like that." I said, "Thank you, Keith. That'll be all." He left. I sat at my desk for a long time. What happened was my property manager, a man named Keith, who I've known for 15 years, mentioned offhand that his neighbor had a child whose heart condition had apparently resolved. He didn't make it a big story. He just said it the way you mention something you can't explain. Kid was supposed to have surgery. Parents couldn't afford it. They took him in Thursday, and the doctor ran the tests 3 times. Nothing wrong. I said, "That's something." Keith shrugged. He said the mother said a man came to her door. She thought he might have been an angel. I went very still. I asked Keith, "What did this man look like?" "Older," he said. "Weathered. Had a canvas bag." I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting at my desk not working. I know how that sounds from the outside. A man who has spent 40 years being decisive and efficient, unable to work because a stranger he turned away 2 weeks ago has come back as a ghost. But it wasn't guilt exactly. Not yet. It was something closer to recognition. Like when you've been mispronouncing a word your whole life and suddenly someone says it right and you hear the shape of your mistake for the first time. He'd said, "You'll be thirsty." I kept turning that over. 62 years old, more money than I could spend, a house that could have housed 4 families, and a man in a worn shirt had looked at my camera and said, "You'll be thirsty." Like he could see something I couldn't. I drove to Ruth's neighborhood that evening. I don't know exactly why. I don't know what I was looking for. I'd spent 40 years being a person who made decisions based on what he could see and count and verify, and I was suddenly driving through neighborhoods I'd never been in, looking for something I didn't have a name for. I found Ruth's house because Keith had mentioned the street. I drove through the neighborhood slowly. It was the kind of neighborhood I had developed properties near but never in. Not because I had decided against it, but because my deals had always found their way toward higher margins, and over time that had shaped the geography of my life into something that excluded whole parts of the city. I parked a few houses down and sat in the car. The Mercedes felt wrong on this street. Not judgmentally, just factually. It was the wrong object in the right place. I sat there for a few minutes trying to understand what I was doing. A successful Jewish real estate developer in his early 60s, sitting in a luxury car on a residential street in a working-class neighborhood at 8 in the evening, looking for a woman he had never met, who might have had a visitor he might have turned away 2 weeks ago. It sounded absurd even inside my own head. But I got out. I walked to the door. I knocked. I parked and sat in the car for a while, feeling stupid. Then I got out and knocked on the door. She answered it. I told her I'd heard about her son. She looked at me carefully. A man she didn't know, standing at her door in the evening, in a car she could see was expensive. She didn't close the door. I asked if she'd tell me about the man who came. She invited me in. I sat in her kitchen while she told me the whole story. Ruth Carpenter is not a dramatic storyteller. She tells things plainly, in the order they happened without inflating them. She didn't need to. The story didn't need inflating. While she talked, Daniel came in wearing his pajamas and looked at me with the calm assessment that children do when they're deciding if a stranger is worth their time. He apparently decided I was acceptable because he climbed up into Ruth's lap and started drawing small circles on her arm with his finger, which seemed to be a habit. I watched this kid sit there, this kid who, according to the echocardiograms, had a hole in his heart the size of a coin, sit there drawing circles on his mother's arm, perfectly fine, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not guilt yet. Something earlier than guilt. Recognition. When Ruth finished, she asked, "Did you know him?" I said I didn't know his name. I said a man matching that description had come to my gate the same morning. She waited. She was good at waiting, in the way that people are who have spent years waiting on things that don't come when you want them. I said I didn't let him in. Ruth went quiet, not the silence of judgment, the silence of someone letting a thing land at its own weight. Then she said, "Mr. Stein, if God sent that man to your door first, it was because he wanted to give you something too." I said I had everything I needed. She didn't flinch at that. She just looked at me with a steadiness that I can only describe as earned. The steadiness of a woman who has spent 4 months kneeling at her sick child's bed asking God for help and kept doing it anyway. She said, "Not everything. You don't have the thing he was offering. You're sitting here at 8 in the evening, in a car that costs more than I make in 3 years, in my kitchen, asking questions you couldn't stop yourself from coming to ask. That's not a man who has everything." I didn't say anything. She said, "That's a man who finally noticed something was missing." I drove home. Miriam was already in bed. I went into my study and I sat there in the dark for a long time. I want to tell you about that night with as much honesty as I can, because it's the center of this account and it would be easy to make it more dramatic or more tidy than it was. It was not dramatic. Nobody spoke from the dark. The room did not fill with light. I sat in my leather chair, which I have owned for 15 years and which I associate with work, with deals, with the business of my life, and I felt the specific weight of 60 years of decisions all arriving in the same room at the same time. I thought about the man at the gate, about his eyes even through the security monitor, about the words he'd said. "Someday, you'll be thirsty." I thought about Daniel Carpenter, 10 miles away, asleep in his bed with a heart that worked. I thought about what Ruth had asked me. If God sent that man to your door, it's because he wanted to give you something too. And then I thought about my mother, who died 12 years ago, and whom I have missed every day since. My mother was a woman of genuine faith, the kind that isn't performing anything, the kind that just lives in a person quietly. She used to say, "Solly, God doesn't knock on the doors of the comfortable and the certain. God knocks on the doors of the ones who need something. You just have to be honest enough to know that you need it." I had told myself for 60 years that I didn't need anything I couldn't provide for myself. Sitting in that room, I finally allowed the honesty. I said out loud, just to the dark, just to whoever might be listening, I said, I know what I did. I know what it was. I'm sorry." The room didn't answer, but something moved, not in the room, in me. Like a window opening in a house that's been closed up for years. And I did something I hadn't done since my bar mitzvah. I talked to God, not the way I'd been doing it, the obligatory Hebrew words at the synagogue, the rote performance of a faith I'd kept as a cultural artifact. I talked the way you talk when you've run out of the thing that was keeping you from talking. I said, I sent him away. I know I sent him away. I don't know who he was, but I know what I did. The room didn't light up. No voice came out of the dark, but something shifted. That's the only word I have for it. Like a door opening in a room that had been sealed for years. I started reading. Not just the Torah, the Gospels. I want to be honest about what it means for a Jewish man of my generation and background to open a New Testament. It is not a neutral act. The history between Christianity and the Jewish people is not simple, not clean, not something you can just put to one side. I know that history. My family knows that history. But I also knew, sitting in that study at 11 o'clock at night, that I had an obligation to follow the question where it went, regardless of where it made me uncomfortable. The Gospels. The Jesus I found there was not the Jesus I had been taught to be suspicious of. He was a Jewish man from Galilee, who quoted the Torah and argued with the Pharisees, and fed the hungry, and healed the sick, and crossed every distance that the respectable people maintained. He was the man who said, "Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me." I read that verse at about 1 a.m. and I had to close the book. I sat there with the closed book in my hands and I thought, he came to my gate. He came dressed as the least of these, and I told him to move along. The specific weight of that realization is not something I've ever been able to put into words that do it justice. It's not guilt exactly. Guilt is about you, about how bad you feel. This was something else. This was clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when you've been making a mistake for a long time, and you finally see it clearly enough to call it by its name. I started reading. Not just the Torah, the Gospels. I read them the way you read something when you suspect it might be about you. And when I got to Matthew 25, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. I had to put the book down and sit with it. He had come to my gate as the least of these, and I had told him to move along. I want to tell you what happened at the doctor's office on Thursday, because Ruth told me, and it belongs in this account. The doctor's name was Kessler. He had been Daniel's cardiologist since the diagnosis. He was a careful man, Ruth said, the kind who double-checked everything and didn't offer hope he couldn't support. He ran the echocardiogram. Then he ran it again. Then he had the technician run it a third time with a different machine. Ruth was in the waiting room while this was happening. She said she sat there for an hour and a half, and at some point she stopped being afraid. She said something happened while she was sitting there. A warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. She said she felt held. She didn't have a better word for it. Held. Dr. Kessler came out to the waiting room and stood in front of her and said, "Mrs. Carpenter, I need to ask you something before I say anything else. This is definitely Daniel, correct? Your son, the same child?" Ruth said yes, she was sure. He said, "The anomaly we documented 4 months ago is not present in any of today's images. There is no structural defect. The septum is intact. The heart is anatomically normal." Ruth said, "Is it possible the first diagnosis was wrong?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I've been a cardiologist for 31 years. I don't misdiagnose ventricular septal defects on echocardiogram. The first diagnosis was not wrong." Ruth asked, "Then what happened?" He said, "I don't know. I genuinely do not know." He sat down in the chair next to her, and they were quiet for a minute. The doctor and the woman whose son had just been healed in a way that neither of them could explain. Then Ruth said, "A man came to our house," and the doctor looked at her and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me." She told him. He listened. When she was done, he took off his glasses and cleaned them with his coat, which she told me is what he does when he needs a moment. Then he said, "I've seen a lot of things in this job. Most of them have explanations. This one doesn't. I'm going to put in my notes that the condition resolves spontaneously, because that's the language medicine has for things it can't account for. But you and I both know what that phrase is a placeholder for." Ruth thanked him. He said no, thank you, that this was going to stay with him for the rest of his practice. I won't tell you the conversion was clean or quick or that I woke up one morning a different person. It wasn't like that. It took months. It took hard conversations with Miriam. The hardest was the first one, where I told her I was being baptized. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Solomon, are you telling me you've become a Christian?" I said yes. She said, "Are you still Jewish?" I said I thought I was both, in a way that I was still figuring out how to explain. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "When we got married, I married you in a synagogue under a chuppah, and you said the words, and you meant them. And I've spent 38 years watching you not live by them. So if Jesus is the thing that's finally making you live by them, fine. That's fine with me." Then she went to get a tissue and came back with red eyes and said, "But you're not getting rid of the Passover Seder." I said I wouldn't dream of it. She said, "And the Friday candles." I said, "Always." She said, "All right then." That was Miriam. It took hard conversations with Miriam, who didn't understand at first, who thought I was having some kind of crisis. It took a lot of sitting in the pew at a small church on the south side of Savannah, not my side of town, not the historic district, learning how to be in a room with people who didn't have what I had, and finding that they had something I didn't. What I can tell you is this. The morning I was baptized, I was 62 years old. The church was small. It was the kind of church that has mismatched chairs and a coffee urn that's been running since before the service started, and a congregation that knows each other by first name. The pastor was a man named Reverend David Webb who had known me for 8 months, since I first started showing up at the back of the room, sitting in the last row like someone who isn't sure they have the right address. He baptized me in a tank of water behind the pulpit, in front of about 40 people, most of whom I had met at the food pantry. Ruth and James were there. Daniel was there. He sat in the front row and watched with the patient attention of a child who understands that something important is happening. I went under the water, I came up, and I cried the way I haven't cried since my mother died. Not sadness, not relief exactly, though there was some of that. The closest I can come to naming it is this: the feeling of being known. Not evaluated, not assessed, not seen through the filter of what I had built or who I had presented myself as for 60 years. Known, the way you know someone you've always loved, even when they went away for a long time. He had known me at the gate. He had known me when I pressed the intercom and said, "I can't help you today." He had known me when I went back to my phone and my coffee and my River Street deal. He had known me at my desk, unable to work. He had known me the whole way. And he had come back anyway. What I can tell you is this. The morning I was baptized, I was 62 years old, and I cried the way I haven't cried since my mother died. Not from sadness, from something else. The specific feeling of being known by something that you thought had given up on you. I tell people now that I didn't lose my Jewish faith when I came to Christ. I completed it. I know not everyone sees it that way, and I understand why. But the God of Abraham, who I grew up knowing, I found him again in Jesus. The God who told Abraham to leave everything and go to a place he couldn't see. The God who said to Moses, "I am who I am." I found him at the door I wouldn't open. 3 years after that morning, Miriam and I opened a food pantry on the block where Ruth lives. I want to tell you about the first day because it matters. We opened at 10 in the morning on a Saturday in November. Miriam had been up since 5. She'd spent the previous month doing the actual work of learning how to run a pantry, talking to people who knew, taking notes, making calls, dealing with the food bank bureaucracy in a way that I would have found irritating, and that she treated like a project worth doing right. She had also quietly donated her jewelry to fund the first 6 months. She told me this the week before we opened, the way she tells me anything she's already decided. Factually, without asking for a reaction. She said, "I sold the pieces. It's in the account. That's the budget." I said, "Miriam, those were..." She said, "They were jewelry. This is more important." Let's talk about the refrigeration units. That was the moment I understood why I had been given her and had not been grateful enough for it. Miriam had been up since 5 making sure everything was in order. I stood at the door at 10 o'clock on a cold November morning, and I thought about the gate. I thought about the security monitor and the coffee and the real estate deal, and the 4 seconds it took me to say no. The first person who came was an elderly woman. She was wearing a coat that had been repaired in several places with different colored thread. She had a canvas shopping bag. She came up to the door slowly, not sure if she was in the right place, and looked at me. I opened the door all the way and said, "Please come in." She came in. I gave her a basket. I helped her find what she needed. When she was done, she held my hand for a moment and said, "God bless you, son." I had to go around the corner and stand there for a minute before I could go back in. By noon, we had served 40 families. By the end of the day, it was 67. I drove home that night with my hands smelling like oranges from stacking produce and my back aching from 3 hours of standing on concrete, and I felt something I had not felt in 62 years of accumulating things. I felt clean. We named it The Traveler. No appointments, no paperwork, no means testing. You come to the door, you eat. I stand at that door myself when I can. Most Tuesdays and Saturdays. I have been told by people who know me from my previous life that this seems like an odd use of a man with my resources and my age, that there are more strategic ways I could be applying whatever I have to offer. Maybe. But I don't think you understand what standing at that door gives me. It gives me eyes. When you stand at a door and you see who comes to it, actually see them, look at their faces, hear the small things they say when they're trying not to ask for too much, something happens to you that no amount of check writing produces. You start to see people. Not categories, not demographics, not the careful distinctions that a successful man makes between the deserving and the undeserving poor. People, with faces, with histories you'll only glimpse. And sometimes someone comes to the door whose eyes do the thing his eyes did on my monitor, that patient attention, that quality of presence that doesn't ask for anything except that you actually be there. When that happens, I go very still. I take a breath, and I open the door all the way. I stand at that door myself when I can. I stand there, and I think about the gate and the camera and the man I sent away on a Tuesday in July. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, someone comes to the door who makes me go still the way I went still at my gate. The eyes. That patience. That thing I don't have a name for. I always open the door now. I always ask if they're hungry. Because I don't know who's on the other side. That's the honest answer. I don't know. The gate is still there. The intercom still works. The security monitor still shows me whoever is standing at my door. But I've changed what I do with that image. I look at their eyes first, before I think about anything else, before I think about my schedule or my coffee or what I'm working on. I look at their eyes and I ask myself, is this someone who needs something? The answer is almost always yes. And then the only real question is whether I'm going to let that matter to me today. That's the whole of it. That's the entire practice I've been building for 3 years since a hot Tuesday in July. Just let it matter. Because I don't know who's on the other side. And I have learned, the hard way and the slow way, that neither did I. Not on that Tuesday morning when I had coffee in one hand and a real estate deal in the other. Ruth's son Daniel is 10 now. He plays baseball. He plays second base, she told me, and he's good at it. His heart is perfect. His doctor says there's no medical explanation. He just shrugs when he says it. The way doctors shrug when they're standing at the edge of something their training didn't cover. I went to one of Daniel's games last spring. Ruth called and mentioned it in passing. She doesn't ask for things directly, that's not how she operates. And I showed up in the bleachers with a hot dog I didn't need and sat between her and James, while a 10-year-old played second base in the Georgia Heat. It was a Thursday evening game, badly attended, the kind of youth baseball where the outfield is more or less unsupervised and the scorekeeping is approximate. I had closed deals worth more than this entire park. I had sat in boardrooms and on planes and in restaurants that cost more per person than the whole park's operating budget. I have never been happier watching anything. James put his arm around Ruth's shoulders in the 3rd inning. Ruth leaned her head against him, They have been through 4 months of sick child vigils and medical debt and nights when he cried in the bathroom so she wouldn't hear him, and they came through it, and here they are, on a Thursday evening, watching their son field a ground ball. That's the miracle. Not just the healed heart. The two of them intact on a bleacher, with a hot dog in each hand. I went to one of Daniel's games last spring. I sat in the bleachers with Ruth and James, eating a hot dog I didn't need, watching a kid I almost prevented from existing run the bases. In the 7th inning, Daniel hit a line drive to left field and made it to second. He looked up into the bleachers and found his mother's face and grinned. James put his hand over his eyes, so I wouldn't see him cry. I put my hand on his shoulder and pretended not to see anyway. Write the word door in the comments. Just door. Let me know you were here. And the next time someone comes to yours, tired, thirsty, asking for the thing that costs you almost nothing to give, look at their eyes before you decide. Just look at their eyes. I want to close with something my rabbi said when I told him I'd been baptized. His name is Rabbi Goldfarb, and he has known me since I was in my 30s. We have been friends for a long time. He is a man who takes his faith seriously and who has seen a great deal of the world. He was quiet for a while after I told him. Then he said, "Solomon, I'm not going to pretend this isn't complicated, but I will tell you what I know. The God who created you, who watched you build everything you built and watched you send that man away from your gate, did not give up on you. The fact that you're here telling me this story means that." I said, "I don't know what I am now." Jewish and Christian sounds like a contradiction. He said, "It sounds like Abraham. It sounds like a man called to leave what he knew and go towards something he couldn't quite see yet." I said, "Did Abraham turn away the strangers at his tent?" He smiled. "No," he said. "Abraham ran toward them. That's in Genesis 18. 3 strangers at his tent, and Abraham ran to meet them and gave them everything. And 2 of them were angels, and 1 of them was God." I said, "I didn't run toward mine." He said, "No, but here you are anyway. That's the mercy of it, I think. The man came to my gate and I sent him away, and the story didn't end there. The story went, and then I found out about Ruth's son, and then I drove across town, and then I sat in the dark and said the words, and then, grace is the and then. I am not the man I was at that gate. I'm slower to judge. I'm faster to the door. I still fail. I still have weeks when the old calculating instincts run the show and I have to notice and correct. But I know what I'm correcting toward now. I know what the eyes looked like. I know what I turned away. The food pantry is open every Tuesday and Saturday. If you're in Savannah and you need it, the address is on the sign out front. It just says, "The Traveler. Come in." If you know someone who needs to hear this story, pass it on. Not because I want the audience, because somebody out there is standing at their gate right now with a buzzer in their hand, and they have 4 seconds, and they don't know what those 4 seconds will cost them. Look at their eyes, open the door. He's still walking these roads. He's still thirsty. He's still arriving at the gates of people who have everything except the one thing he came to give. Write the word door in the comments. There are some things I want to say to specific people before I finish. To the Jewish men and women who are watching this, I know what this looks like from the outside. I know the history. I know what the cross has meant to our people over 2,000 years, and I am not asking you to forget that. I am not asking you to dismiss it. What I'm asking you to do is what my rabbi suggested. Read the Gospels with the same eyes you read Torah. Look at the Jesus who fed the hungry and healed the sick, and crossed every boundary that the respectable people maintained. Look at the Jesus who said the whole law hangs on 2 things: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. That's Deuteronomy and Leviticus. That's the Torah. He was not abolishing what we were given. He was living it all the way. And look at what he said about the stranger at the gate. I was that story. I lived that story on the wrong side of it, and then I got to live it on the right side, and I can tell you the difference from the inside. To the people who have everything, I know you. I was you. I know the feeling that your good fortune is a kind of insulation, that the things you've built separate you from the kind of need that comes to your gate with a canvas bag. I know how easy it is to tell yourself that charity means writing a check to an established organization, that you've done your part, that the man at the gate is someone else's problem. He came to your gate specifically. He knows your name, he knows what you're carrying and what you're missing, and he came to the right address. Open it. To the people who have almost nothing, who are sitting in a house like Ruth and James's house, watching a child who is sick, praying into the same morning ceiling for the 4th month in a row. Your prayers are not going nowhere. I am the evidence that your prayers are going somewhere. Ruth and James opened a door for a stranger and their son was healed. And across town, a man who should have opened his door and didn't got his own second chance, which came in the form of standing in Ruth's kitchen, hearing about a miracle he had almost been part of but had disqualified himself from. God does the second chance. That is apparently part of the design. And to whoever is standing at a gate right now, in whatever form that gate takes, the gate of your heart, the gate of your generosity, the gate of whatever you've built that you're protecting, the man on the other side of it is patient. He was patient at my gate for as long as it took me to get there. He's patient at yours. The door is the testimony. Everything else is just what happened when I opened it. Write door in the comments. I want to tell you one more thing about the man who came to my gate. I have thought about him many thousands of times in the years since. I've read the Gospels looking for the man I saw on that monitor. I've read Luke 24, the 2 disciples walking the road to Emmaus with a stranger who turned out to be Jesus, recognizing him only in the breaking of bread. I've read Genesis 18, where Abraham runs toward 3 strangers at his tent and one of them is God. The tradition is consistent. He walks among us. He comes in the form of the ones we have every reason to pass by. He comes specifically to the people who need most to see him, and the people who need most to see him are usually the people who think they don't need anything at all. I was that person. I had built myself a gate specifically so I would not have to see the faces of people who needed something. I thought it was protection. It was a blindfold. Here is what I know now. The thing he was offering at my gate was not an inconvenience. It was a gift. He came to offer me the thing I had been missing for 60 years without knowing I was missing it. He came to break open something that had been sealed since I was young and decided that success meant never needing anything from anyone. He offered it in the form of an old man in a worn shirt on a hot morning in July, asking for something that cost me nothing. I said no. He went to Ruth's house and did what he had come to do. And then, 2 weeks later, through a property manager named Keith and a drive I couldn't explain, and a woman who looked at me and said, "You're a man who finally noticed something was missing," he came back for me. That's what I want you to take from this. He came back. The door I didn't open did not close permanently. It stood there. And when I finally got myself to the right address, when I was finally low enough, humble enough, honest enough, it was still open, still waiting. That is what grace is. Not the first knock, the fact that he keeps knocking. Write door in the comments. One last thing, about my father's jar of quarters. After he died, I found it in a box in the basement. It was a mason jar, the old kind with the metal ring lid. Inside, maybe 40 or 50 quarters, all old ones, silver ones from the 60s and 70s. He had been refilling that jar for 30 years. I didn't keep the quarters. I took the jar. It sits on my entry table now, right where his did, where I can see it from wherever I am in the entryway. It's full of cash, not quarters, bills, whatever I put in it when I walk past. It is the most useful thing I own. My father used to say, "Solly, my business is the quarter. Everything else is details." I know now what he meant. The quarter is the act of stopping, of actually seeing the person in front of you, of making the decision for just that moment that their need matters more than whatever you are doing. Everything else, the food pantry, the baptism, the Gospels, the years of learning to be a different kind of man, all of it started with the decision I didn't make one Tuesday morning in July, and then the second chance that came through a property manager, and a drive across town and a woman in a kitchen who looked at me like I was a man who had finally noticed something was missing. I did. Write door in the comments. Let me know you were here. May Jesus walk with you today and in every day that is still ahead of you. Amen.